All right, let's begin in verse 8. Scornful men bring a city into a snare, but wise men turn away wrath. All right. One thing I wanted to look at, again, we always compare the phrases, right, and try to connect the parts that connect. Certainly scornful men and wise men are opposites, right, and they would contradict one another. And the one brings a city into a snare, and a wise man turns away wrath. However, what I wanted to consider about the wrath part, to me, as I think about this and look at this, the scornful man and wrath, is there not a connection between those two, in that the reason he is so scornful and scorning and mocking are similar, and he has that type of active against attitude is because of wrath and anger in his heart, right? So we do see some overlapping there between those two. Scorning, I think, we said mocking, but I think it's an emotional response to something that's undesired situation. And in the Bible, there's people that mocked from a righteous standpoint. When we consider Elijah, do you remember when he mocked the prophets of Baal, right? And so there is a limited use of mocking even in the right sense. But there is that mocking in and of itself is emotional, it's an emotional tool, if you will, to bring about a desired response. But in the verse here, it says that the scornful men bring a city into a snare, into a trap, into a problem, right? Why would scornful men bring a city into a snare? My approach connects with the anger part that's in the second phrase, and to me it has to do with both anger and scornful have emotions behind it. And when you have emotions that are controlling, and there's no logic, there's no wisdom, there's no problem solving or reasoning, bad things usually happen, right? When emotion just totally takes over and there's nothing else. In the context of a city, what does unrestrained emotion look like in a city? Unrestrained anger in a large group of people. Mobs, chaos, and riots, right? Most often the people that are rioting, they are very angry, right? They're very emotional, they're very upset about something, and a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, when it gets down to it, there's some big chunks of logic that's missing, right? Like sometimes they have the story wrong, or sometimes when you think through their response, it actually makes the situation worse instead of better, right? So there's some big chunks of, and sometimes there's legitimate complaints, but the use of rioting to get across your point is very counterproductive. That's like saying, I wish this city was nicer, so we're just going to burn it to the ground. Well, what does it look like after that? It looks a whole lot worse, right? We don't get enough attention. Well, the attention that you want is not police, throwing you in jail and shooting, mace at you, So there's a logical element that's missing. And here in the second part it says, but wise men turn away wrath. Wise men turn away wrath. And the question is, why? Why do wise men turn away wrath? Okay, well that would be how. But my deeper question is why?
They solve the problem instead of just getting angry with it.
Okay, so again, that's more of the what. I'm getting at why. Why do wise men turn away anger? I have two answers.
In this context, it would be to save the city.
Okay, yes. So a wise man understands that there's great danger in unrestrained anger, right? So there's a reason why there. Also, the second area too is if you're blind, when you're angry, you can't think, right? You're not thinking straight. When a wise man sees that anger has to be shut down before you can move ahead and actually make steps and actually, solve the problem, right? When someone's angry and they're just blind with rage, you're not going to be able to really get anywhere. But when the anger is suppressed and put away and put down, then you can move forward and solve the problem that's causing the anger. Because sometimes the anger sometimes is over legitimate problems, legitimate complaints. But when that emotion is in control, there's not going to be resolution. All right? Does that make sense? So some people think that if they just get angry enough that things will change. And we talked about riots. And real change does not come from emotion alone. Emotion can be part of it. Sorrow can be a helpful emotion if it's combined with other things, with repentance and so on and so forth. But some of those things. Question then, in the Bible, were there any cities that were brought into a snare or that avoided the snare through wise men turning away wrath? How about Nineveh? Right? Nineveh turned away from wrath through the wisdom of Jonah's preaching, right? I know wisdom might be not the word we would think of when we think of Jonah. They listened, right? Yes?
I know there was a story, but I think it was a wise woman where the one guy fled into their city, and then when they went to besiege it, she went out to them and mediated, and they ended up giving that person over to them.
Right.
And seeing the city destroyed.
Right. Yep, okay. So, also, the city was not spared, but when you think of Sodom and Gomorrah, they wanted to rape those angels, and there was a riotous group there, right? And all of that mess. Lot was delivered from that, but the city was punished because they were taken in the snare of their sinfulness. So there's maybe an application there, okay? So we see the truth and principle. Now when it comes down to us, God could use our church in a way in this city, and as we have faith and view the future, we may have more influence in the city and things. But certainly on a personal level, we need to be the wise person that turns away anger, right? That deals with anger in a way that it's suppressed or controlled or eliminated to where problems can be solved. Recognizing that anger doesn't solve problems, right? And there is righteous anger. A lot of anger is not righteous, but there is righteous anger at sin. But even there, anger alone by itself doesn't solve problems. It needs to be combined with wisdom, with reasoning, with the truth of God, with wisdom to have a path forward. All right? Any questions on verse 8? Yes? Or applications?
I think of the city of Jerusalem when they were taken in captivity, when they're going to be taken in captivity, and you have Jeremiah preaching to them, telling them, don't resist. When you resist, you're going to annihilate us.
Yeah.
The Lord, this is of the Lord, take it. And they refused to heed that, and the city was leveled because they refused to
Yeah.
preach to Jeremiah.
Yeah, well, there was several. Yes, the final destruction. You're right. They ignored, but in the first invasion, they listened. I have to go back and refresh my story of Jeremiah a little bit. But you're right. He preached about accepting this as from God, as from the Lord, and he was trying to avoid that anger and was seeing reality. Anger doesn't see reality, so that's a good comment. Any others on this verse?
I don't think it's the, I think of David.
Sure.
And Abigail, what's his name?
Ah, yes, Abigail.
Think about that
Yes.
when
And
he first asked.
her husband was Nabal?
Yeah.
Nabal, yes. And certainly she was the one that diffused that anger, wasn't she? And saved lives. So, his blind rage didn't accomplish anything, did it? Yeah. Very good. Anyone else? All right, very good thoughts. Verse 9. Verse 9 says, if a wise man contend with a foolish man, whether he rage or laugh, there is no rest. All right, I think we can all kind of, maybe we have mental videotapes going through our minds or, things we've been through that we kind of see this played out. So what's another word for contend, maybe? Fight, argue, wrestle, debate, yes. Contention, all right? They're contending, debating, argument, fighting, all these are good. And it says, whether he rage or laugh. Again, what do we see in those two words? Emotion. Very good. The emotions. Rage would be the anger, right? Laugh would be that mockery or the jesting or the, just not caring. Or perhaps you could even say an empty, joyful laugh. But the idea is that there's no rest. What do you think of when there's no rest? Lack of peace. What did you think of college? Okay. Now, the hope is that there's a wise man actually in the conversation. When you got two fools, it's even worse, right? Yeah. Exhaustion, right? How about this? How about the argument never stops, right? There is no rest. There's no resolution. There's no coming to an agreement, right? So it appears that the raging and the laughing is done by who? the fool, right? And so again, we have the idea that this foolish man is controlled by his emotion, right? He's not able to reason with him. You're not able to, make this argument come to a conclusion with him. Sometimes because he's so close-minded. Other times it's because that emotion is just controlling his thinking and he's not able to think straight.
So is this saying that it's really useless to even try and reason with a foolish man, or
Well,
that's the outcome?
I think there can be a case-by-case thing. I mean, there's a lot of variables. You have to consider, is this just you and the fool, or are there other people present? You have to consider, the Bible does say, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. So there's not a clear answer on that one. That's where you just need all the wisdom of Proverbs to know what to do there. So were you going to add on to that?
I was thinking the same thing.
About that verse?
Yeah, answer not a fool according to his folly, when I have to answer a fool according to his
Mhm.
folly. It's based
Right.
on what needs to be done. If something
Yeah.
is blaspheming to the Lord, I need to answer him to his face.
Right.
Blasphemy.
Yeah. And again, that's why I said if there's other people present, sometimes you may not get anywhere with the fool, but those that are listening may benefit from what's said or not said and so on. So again, we have this idea of this foolish one being so emotional. And I wanted to just take a minute to talk about emotion and truth. Because we got to be careful that we are persuaded by truth and not simply by emotion. Some people are very emotional, right? Some people are, and by emotion isn't bad. Emotion isn't bad. Emotion is bad when it becomes uncontrolled, when it becomes, the only thing. Some churches, I think, have you ever been to a dead church? Right? And then have you ever been to a church that was controlled by emotion? All right? And, I believe somewhere in between those two is the biblical spirit-filled church, And so you can see the pendulum swing. But we got to be careful with emotion because sometimes people let emotion be their guiding light, Well, if it makes me feel good, I'll do it. If it makes me feel bad, I won't, type approach to life. And some people decide truth that way. Truth makes me feel good. Not truth makes me feel bad, or things like that. For instance, how about this one? Have you ever believed someone because they were crying about it? Some people are able to turn on the tears just like that. And well, they were real serious about it, so they must have been telling the truth. They were crying. I saw those tears in their eyes, right? Well, if you know the person really well, that might be true. But if you're working with a stranger, you don't know what's going on, Just because someone cries doesn't mean it's true. How about this one? Have you ever heard a yelling preacher who was very convinced about something, right? And he was yelling loudly about it, right? Well, that means it must be true, right? Well, not necessarily. If it's clear in the Bible, then it's true, right? And if God said it, it's true. But just because the preacher said it doesn't mean it's true. So there's different ways that sometimes people substitute emotion as a test of truth. Do you understand what I'm talking about? So we have to have the wisdom of the Lord and be careful. Because certainly emotions are part of who we are. It's not wrong to have emotions. But again, it's when we use emotion in a wrong way, or when other people's emotions, or we use our own emotions in a wrong way, that's overpowering other faculties that God has given us. And so, tears are not wrong, laughter is not wrong, yelling isn't even wrong in the right context, okay? But we don't want to substitute emotion as proof of truth, okay? Any questions on verse 9? Okay, verse 10. Verse 10, the bloodthirsty hate the upright, but the just seek his soul. I like the way this is phrased. The bloodthirsty hate the upright. All right? Just, it drips with meaning, okay? That you can see the blood dripping off, all right? And you can see them coming behind with the straw, right? Right? Of course, it's not literal, right? I had a purpose in saying that, okay? I'm not just being gross. But it's not literally speaking of like blood and drinking, right? But when someone's bloodthirsty, what does it mean? They want to what? Shed blood. All right.
They're determined to get you.
Right. So another way of saying shed blood might be what? Kill, right? Murderous, right? The bloodthirsty hate the upright. Now, there's different reasons people would be thirsting for blood in the sense of wanting to kill someone, right? Lots of different reasons why. But Could be someone, like there are people that actually enjoy killing people, all right? We call them psychotic and neurotic and what other words do we use? Manic, crazy, serial killers. So there are people that actually enjoy killing. However, as I said, I think I may have said this earlier, most people that murder don't do it because they enjoy murder, right? They do it why? Sometimes. There's a lot of reasons, right? They kill for lust, they kill for greed, they kill for pride, they kill because the lie might get out, they need the money, the life insurance, there's lots of reasons. But so when the verse says the bloodthirsty, I tend to think definitely of the evil man, but it can refer very specifically to that one that likes to murder, the murderous person. He hates the upright. Or it could be somebody that has something against the upright person because of their sin, right? The upright one will tell the truth on their job and they'll get fired for it, right? And they're making 80 grand a year and they're not about to get fired for that job, right? So they'll kill you for it, right? Or 800 grand or whatever it may be. That bloodthirsty hate the upright. All right, so we can understand that. A bloodthirsty person would hate the upright. Why? Because we, in our living and our speaking, are directly opposed to what they're doing. And sometimes the fruit of their deeds will be brought to light through what is said. Does anybody want to turn to John 3 for me and read a couple verses there? All right. I'll have Mrs. Bream read it. John 3. And read verse 19 to verse 21 of John 3. And this has the idea that the Christian life in righteousness is a prick in the conscience of the lost man. Read John 3, 19 to 21.
And this is the condemnation, that light is come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone that doeth evil hateth the light, neither cometh to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. But he that doeth truth cometh to the light, that his deeds may be made manifest, that they are wrought from God.
Okay, so again you have two people. There's one light, that is the light, the Lord Jesus, and the righteous one comes to the light and his deeds are manifest. They're wrought in God, they're righteous, they're holy. And the other one does not want to come to the light lest he be reproved. And you can see that truth intersecting with the truth of this verse, right? The bloodthirsty hate the upright. Now, let's consider this second phrase. But the just seek his soul. Now we have a pronoun, and when you find a pronoun, you need to find its what? Antecedent. Can we all say that word? Antecedent. It's the word that the pronoun is talking about. So when you say, I hate him, well, the question is, who's him, right? Who is he talking about? Who's him? When it says here, his, the just seek his soul, well, who is the his? Who is he of the his? All right. And the only other option would be the upright. All right, so it's either the upright or the bloodthirsty. To me, I think bloodthirsty makes a whole lot of sense, because in the context of judicial law, the just seek the soul of the murderous one, right, to bring him to punishment for his deeds. And I think seeking the soul speaks of the soul of the bloodthirsty, all right, the one that needs to be punished, he needs to be locked up, all right, he needs to be, and seek his soul really means put him to death, all right. I think that's the understanding. Now, some people say that this is referring to seeking the soul of the righteous, with the context that, if you think of it this way, that the bloodthirsty is out to kill the righteous man, and the righteous man wants to take him to court or to the leaders to have him put away or killed or imprisoned or whatever, right? The bloodthirsty is out to kill, so the idea is that the just man will seek the soul of the upright one to protect them, to save them, to rescue them, much like Obadiah under Ahab hid the prophets, right? And Ebed-Melech under Zedekiah was also one that rescued and hid the righteous from the bloodthirsty, okay? I tend to see it that the just seek his soul is referring to the soul of the bloodthirsty one, that they're to be punished and brought to justice, okay? So if we connect this verse with the prior two verses and kind of have a context flowing through, again, we go back to this idea of murder, and murder flows out of these different evil attitudes, right? Lust, greed, pride, deceit, all these different things, right? And when you have a bloodthirsty person, they are controlled by their rage, right? They're hate, greed, lust, all these things, right? So you have someone that's controlled by their emotion. So when we connect this with the emotions we've looked at in the last few verses, emotions must not supersede rules and justice. And the idea here is that the just person seeking the soul of this bloodthirsty one refers to punitive justice for his evil deeds before the court of law. All right? I know that's kind of high-minded words and figuring out what all that means, but very simply, the just person seeks that this person would be punished. And it doesn't, some people feel sorry for the murderers, right? And they're like, oh, don't kill the murderers, don't kill the rapists, they shouldn't be put to death, and on and on and on. And the just person says, no, they have committed wickedness and evil, and there should be a putting to death. So whether or not there's emotion, pro or con, emotion doesn't really matter. The facts matter. So that's sort of the approach of this verse, okay? Questions or comments on verse 10? Do we understand it? Sure.
Can you look at it as also, I understand how you're saying that as far as the bloodthirsty, but the unsaved against the Christian, the upright.
Oh, I see. In a broader sense of like evil against good?
Right.
Yes.
And that upright man seeking after that soul to bring them to Christ? Is that kind of, no.
I wouldn't say you could see it that way in the Old Testament. Simply because when it says that phrase seeking his soul, that like if we think of it in a New Testament way, it sounds good. But in the context of Proverbs and the way that like seeking the soul refers to putting them to death. Like it's a phrase that's like that. So I couldn't understand it that way. Now your point is very true, that in our context as the saved, we should seek those that are lost to be rescued from sin. But again, I think the context of verse 10 is not in the spiritual realm as much as it's in the government realm. Because remember, who wrote Proverbs? Solomon. What's that? Well, they were Solomon's Proverbs that the king of Hezekiah copied out. But up through, now some people believe chapter 31 was written by Bathsheba, or, chapter 31 is a different part. But these were written by Solomon, and he was wanting to help all his sons, his many, many sons, become familiar with running the government, right, and having a right view of society and government and governing. And so there's wisdom, there's a lot of wisdom in the Proverbs that's related to that. And so to me, it's a societal, it's a view of, look, you got these bloodthirsty, hating the righteous, and the righteous want them to be punished for their evil, and that's right and good, and as a king, you need to make that happen. So your point is valid, maybe just not in this verse. Okay?
So this could be an argument for capital punishment?
Sure, yeah. Definitely, and we looked at another verse that was even more clear about an argument for capital punishment in Proverbs. I'm not sure, it might have been when you were gone. What's that?
You did say death. I was thinking more of just justice.
Right.
Justice,
Well,
but it does.
yeah, the phrase seeking the soul, and again, that perfectly matches the idea of bloodthirsty, because it's somebody that's murderous. This isn't just like, taking your neighbor's goat or something, This is serious evil here. So, yes. All right. Any other questions on verse 10? All right. Verse 11. A fool uttereth all his mind, but a wise man keepeth it in till afterwards. All right. Any questions? Just kidding. Just kidding. Have you ever heard Lincoln's quote, "Better to be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt"? All right. Yeah.
I got that a lot too.
Abe Lincoln. Guys got the Abe Lincoln wisdom there. So, in the context of the verse, what's one way that some people like to spiritualize or explain their speaking all their mind? What's one way people spiritualize speaking all their mind? What's that? Because it's true. That's one. Which, another way to say that in a different way is that they're just being honest about what they really feel, right?
Yeah.
I'm just going to be honest and just say what I feel. Certainly, according to the verse, speaking all our mind is a foolish thing. But I would also like to point out that the reason a fool can speak all of his mind is because there's not that much there. If you have a mind full of things, there's no way you could say it all, right? But it says a wise man keepeth it until afterward. The word afterward tells us that this deals with time, right? So perhaps the idea here is that a fool would say everything in one moment that should be separated out into a different time. Some people, like for instance, let's consider this. There's been a death in the family, right? Here's Billy Joe, and she's sobbing. She's grieving. She's in sorrow. There's probably some things that should be said to Billy Joe, but maybe not the day her mom died, right? You know, like wouldn't it be a wise thing that someone look into the will? Well, yeah, but not the day her mom died, right? Wise man keepeth it until afterward. Considering the timing of your words. When you're working with, children, sometimes there's certain things they can handle at certain ages. And again, it blows. Oh, it's this one, isn't it? Is it this? Okay. Well, I thought, how is it? Oop, there it goes on. It was already off. I don't understand that. Doesn't matter. We'll just leave it till afterward. How's that? She got it. But Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, there's a time to speak and a time to be silent, right? And what wisdom knows when those times are, right? And let's just think in general, and I tried to put this in a picture format so we'd remember it, but the words of a fool are like chickens in their roosting holes, ready to pop out at any moment, right? You ever seen chickens like they kind of stick their heads out, right? It's just ready to come out, like momentary, instantaneous, right? But the words of the wise are like buckets from a deep well, where they take time to rise up to the surface, right? So the difference is that a wise person knows the power of words. They know a lot of things, and they know that there's some things they don't know. So the idea is they carefully measure and think about their words rather than just blurting out what comes to mind, right? And certainly the verse is there, a fool uttereth all his mind. So some of us are more prone to speaking quickly, to speaking without thinking. Some of us are very prone to sharing our opinions, right? Very opinionated. And the Bible is just saying, there are times to speak and there are times to be silent. And a wise man knows that there are sometimes it's better to wait till after the service, after the camp was over, after the funeral. Then you can talk about the will, right? After the whatever. A wise man knows his times much better than the fool. All right, questions or comments?
Maybe another way to apply it could also be like the wise man is keeping it into afterwards. He's listening to everything first instead of just going, oh, I know the situation, and just filling everything
Yes.
instead of listening and then responding.
Yes. That's very good.
Timing.
Mm-hmm. But the wise man keeps it in, and part of the reason he's keeping it in is because he's wanting to learn more about the situation, yeah. Some people are ready to give you all their advice about X when they just met you,
I was trying to think of the other verse was like, quick to hear and slow to speak.
Oh, in James, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. Yes, that's a good verse to connect with it.
I was thinking this verse that a wise man will keep it until afterwards. He's organizing his thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
It's good and appropriate. He's tactfully and therefore has the most impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's considering how he's going to say things and making sure it has its most potency to its words. All right, anyone else? Okay, let's do verse 12. Verse 12, if a ruler hearken to lies, all his servants are wicked. Bam. That's kind of a tough proverb, right? I think a key to understanding this verse is, well, who's a servant and who's not, right? Because, we're citizens, right? But, is that the same as a servant? But let's, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the details, the general principle here is that when there is evil in the top, it tends to flow down, right? Have you ever heard of trickle-down economics? Well, there's trickle-down morality too, all right? And the idea is when there's evil at the top, it tends to come down to those that are under. like for instance, when you have an evil ruler and you're working for him, he's going to want you to lie because he's lying, right? He's going to want you to steal because he's stealing. He's going to want you to pretend because he's pretending, right? So especially when you're working for him, you get drawn up into the evil, all right? Verse 12 here. So evil, the corruption that is above flows down to those below. And another thing, too, is birds of a feather flock together. So there's a sense, too, where some people define, when it says his servants, some people define that as like the inner circle, like the people that are with him, like his team, his servants, like his personal servants or his cabinet or his board or, the people working right with him. They have to be evil, too. Others have a broader definition of like anyone who is any way connected, But certainly it's a broad statement, right? All his servants are wicked. And in the Bible, we can find certain exceptions of people like Daniel. Daniel served under Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar was filled with pride and evil things in his kingdom. And Obadiah served under Ahab, and Obadiah turned out to be righteous. So I think the truth is that there can be exceptions to this, but we shouldn't think that we're going to somehow be an exception. We should recognize when there's someone evil in charge and you're working right there with them, then you're going to be wrapped up, you're going to be drawn up into it too, unless there's some sort of special grace of God in the mix. So certainly the scripture here is giving out the general principle.
Could this verse be looking through the eyes of the ruler, in that if he hearkens to lies, then he's going to see everyone as being a liar? Nebuchadnezzar may have looked at Daniel, although I don't think he did, but he could have seen him as, well, he's no better than I am, because he assumes everybody's like he is.
Oh, like he doesn't trust anyone?
He doesn't trust. He just assumes that they.
That's a great. I never thought of it that way, but that does make sense, because if you listen to lies, it would corrupt your view of things.
Your thinking is that everybody else is just like that, and don't have the discernment to recognize that.
Yeah.
Everyone is like that.
I've never heard of that, but that would. I don't know a reason that wouldn't be legitimate. So.
I don't know. I just had the thought of, it does. I'm thinking of it this way. It says that he hearkens to lies, which might mean that he doesn't realize he's, listening to lies, and maybe he's being deceived. And thought of, if the king's being deceived, then his inner council would
take advantage of him,
or they would have to be. None of them would be telling him, hey, these people are lying to you. Where it might be thought of, if the king is hearkening to lies, all those around him are wicked because they're not
telling the truth about this situation. Yeah. Well, those are some very valid ways to look at this verse and understand it another way. Taking all the same data and everything, but just different perspectives. So.
Even has another step further is that the person underneath says, well, he just listens to lies anyway, so what's the use of going to him and what?
Yeah, he won't hear the truth type idea. Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, that's a very good point. Very good point there with both of those. Yeah. Anyone else? All right. Let's do verse 13. We have 3 more verses. The poor and the deceitful man meet together. The Lord lighteneth both their eyes. All right. What does it mean to have light in your eye?
I think of enlightening, where it's like, oh, yeah, I understand now, understanding.
Okay. Yeah. There's another phrase in the Bible. I don't know if this is Bible or if this is something else. Have you ever heard the phrase, lest I sleep the sleep of death? And the Bible does use this phrase of giving light to the eye as the idea of giving life. Like you could say, well, the ability to see, but the idea is when you're dead, you can't see, right? And the Lord lightening the eyes speaks of He gives them life. So that's the way I understand that phrase of lightening the eyes, giving life. And the application, when we connect it with the first phrase then, is that God gives life to poor people. God gives life to deceitful people. To me, it's a verse about common grace. Have you all heard the phrase common grace? The Lord sends the rain on the just and on the unjust, right? The idea that God is good to all. And it's not that He's not good to those that don't get saved because He provided a Savior for them. But it's the idea that even when God knows there are people that won't get saved, he still sends good things to them in the life. He sends them rain. He gives them life. Because certainly God's a God of life and death. He has power over life and death, shall we say. And so God could just, snuff out the wicked immediately, right? But he gives them time to repent. He gives them common grace, rain, light, food. Evil people get food on their table. Evil people go to the hospital and come out better. That's not to say they always do, but God is a God of common grace. So that's the way I understand that. And then I want to take this a step further, is that the fact that God gives life to a man does not endorse his living, the way he lives, does not endorse his actions. Because a lot of us think, well, why doesn't God just kill them? I mean, if they're that bad, why doesn't God just kill them, right? Well, the very simple truth is that God gives life, and he doesn't. Death comes from Satan. God's a God of life. Death is a fruit of sin. And certainly there are times where in judgment God does take the life. But God's a God that wants to be gracious, that wants to give. And so the fact that someone is living in sin doesn't mean that God should just all of a sudden snuff them out, right? If that were true, God should have snuffed us out, right? Long ago. Maybe yesterday, who knows? So simply the fact that God gives life to man is not an endorsement of his lifestyle. I think that's a very good conclusion from this verse here. Okay? So, any questions on this verse? Verse 13?
Not really a
Or comment, it's fine.
question. Just the whole lightning both their eyes kind of remind me of Psalm 19, verse 8. The commandment of the Lord is pure, lightning the eyes.
Yes. And there's no doubt that in some places in Scripture, the idea of lightening the eyes speaks of understanding, as someone mentioned over here. And like when a lost person gets saved, I once was blind, but now I see. So there's no doubt that that's sometimes the case. The problem I have with that understanding is when you connect it with the first phrase, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense about the Lord lightening the deceitful man's eyes, unless you want to say that that he brings them to understanding and then they get saved or they're not deceitful. But that is true that lightening the eyes can also refer to understanding as well. So, Psalm 19, verse 8.
Because lightning and enlightening, I'm assuming, are two very different words.
I would have to look that up. I don't know. That is true that they may. I mean, there's certainly different words in English, but I think they're similar in meaning in English, but they might have different ideas.
Could it be that they do both mean life in a sense?
Right.
But it's different types of life.
That's a great observation, yes. Because life comes from truth, right? All life comes from God, truth comes from God. And so there's physical life of breathing, and there's spiritual life. And spiritual life involves understanding and seeing, right? Seeing our sin and so on. So there's certainly an overlap between those two, which is great to point out. So. Okay. Oh, enlighten. Yeah, I'm not surprised that it's the same word, but the application would be the difference. One applies to physical, the other spiritual. Okay, any other questions on this verse? Comments? All right, verse 14. Verse 14 says, "The king that faithfully judgeth the poor, his throne shall be established forever." All right, there were some kings that did not have their throne established forever, right? They were overthrown, they were murdered, they died, their disease got them, right? But the idea with established forever has the idea of a long reign, maybe of his children then reigning after him. The Bible speaks of David's reign being without end, and that implies his descendants will sit on the throne. One day Jesus will come to this earth and sit on the throne. So we understand the idea of the throne being established forever. The first phrase says, "The king that faithfully judgeth the poor." Now, faithfully judgeth the poor. Faithfully, we could use the word consistently, right? Regularly, fairly, all wrapped up in that word faithfully. And then judgeth would have the idea of enforcing the laws, justice, right? These words like this, enforcing the law properly. Faithfully judgeth the poor. The poor is those that don't have money, and when you're poor, when it comes to government, you also don't have close. Yeah, that's the idea. you don't have influence, right? Like when you're wealthy, you can buy the politicians, right? And when you're wealthy, you can hobnob with the king, right? But the poor, I mean, king's not going to spend time with them, right? And let's be honest, a lot of politicians spend their time fundraising. And they have these intimate dinners where you spend $2,000 a plate, right, to come in and, what's the whole idea is that the people with the money get to spend time and influence, right? But here it says the king that faithfully judgeth the poor. Well, what's the idea here with the poor? Well, this is basic. This is real basic. If everyone is rich, no one is rich. All right, let's think that through. If everyone is rich, no one is rich. And why is that? Because the definition of rich is that you have more than someone else, right? And so if everybody has the same, then no one's rich, right? So there's a lot more poor people than there are rich people, right? And that's just based on linguistics, right? There's no way it can be other. Even in America, where we have a high standard of living, we still talk about the poor. Well, that just means those who have less than the people that have more, right? So, but it says that there's more of the poor, and by definition, there's always going to be more of the poor because that's how rich. That's the word rich means more than everyone else. All right. So there's lots of poor people, and the verse says, "The king that faithfully judgeth the poor." In other words, the masses, the majority, right? He's faithfully, consistently having justice, following the laws that he has made in wisdom and in fairness. Then what happens? There is peace. The poor are content, right? The masses are content. When lots of people get upset, let's go back to our first couple of verses, what happens? Riots, right? And burnings and pillaging and, so on and so forth. And here it's saying, look, if you have fairness, if you have consistency, if you treat them as the rules say and as the law says, there will be a long reign. But if you raise taxes on the poor people, it'll be like Nottingham. And you'll have Robin Hoods going around, right? Stealing from the rich to feed the poor. No, let's go back to another Bible story about a guy who wanted to raise taxes on everybody. Wait a minute. It was this guy's son, wasn't it? Oh my goodness, didn't he read this verse? He didn't get it, did he? We've mentioned Rehoboam a lot as we've gone through Proverbs. Have you noticed that? You notice that? Rehoboam didn't read the book or something, because he certainly missed the boat. And what was he doing? He was wanting to raise the taxes on everyone, right? And the poor said, no way. We've been paying what we thought were big taxes with Solomon, and you're wanting to raise them more. And there was rebellion. So he didn't have a long reign because 10 out of the 12 tribes, he had zero reign with them, okay? Get it? So certainly a couple were loyal to him, but the rest flew the coop. So I think we understand the truth of that verse. Also, let's remember that the poor can be oppressed. A lot of times, poor people can't hire lawyers. And the idea of a public defender is not a common thing, but it's our privilege in America to have public defenders. And of course, some of them, you might as well not have a lawyer, but that's another story. But there's the idea that the poor can be oppressed so easily. If a king will just be fair, will just do what's right, treat them right, he will protect the interests of the poor as well, protect them from being taken advantage of and manipulated as well. All right, so we've crossed this mountain long enough. Any other questions, comments?
With his being fair to the poor and the masses also mean that he would be fair to everyone else. So it's not just that he's fair to them, but overall.
Right. And I think the idea is if he treats the poor right, by definition, he'll probably treat the rich right. I mean, there can be exceptions to that, of course, with your philosophy of government and things. But generally, the people with influence are going to make sure they influence enough so that they aren't mistreated. You know what I mean? Use that money to their advantage. So that's the...
On the other side of it, since he's being fair to these people, he would be less likely to be the type of person that would accept bribes.
Right. Oh, yeah. Right. That's a great point. Right. Yes. That's very good.
His throne shall be established forever. I kind of think it as people remember his rule for kind of like people for generations remember the rule of Reagan. Reagan's presidency, however, like Wilson and Coolidge, you don't really remember anything from them. It's not that they were bad, it's just
Okay.
people remember this.
Yes, like he will go down in history as a good king, right? Much like, the idea of the King Cyrus that let all the people go back to Israel. Like, they loved him for that, and no doubt he was remembered for that. Yeah, and that's a great point about his throne should be established forever it will always be a good taste in their mouth as they think back. Like, for instance, George Washington has always been, nobody's ever said, oh, that dirty old President George Washington, right? And that's been how many, 200 years ago, right? So, yes, that's a good point to make about the way in which they're perceived long term. Any other questions? All right, one more verse. We should stand for this one. Just kidding. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. Now, if there was a verse in the Bible that said, spare the rod and spoil the child, this would be the closest to it probably. Probably the closest to it would be spare the rod and spoil the child. It would be right here. However, if you notice in the verse, there's actually two things that bring wisdom, right? The rod and reproof. There's some parents that try to only use the rod. Doesn't work very well. There's some parents that try to only use reproof. Doesn't work very well. And a child needs a combination of pain and words. To put it bluntly, combination of pain and words. When there's no pain, the words are not listened to. When there's no words, the pain is misunderstood. And in child rearing, you must have both. You must have pain, you must have words. The rod and reproof give wisdom. And the second phrase says, a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. And an easy way to define a child left to himself is one who did not receive the rod and did not receive reproof. Okay? That's a good way to define the child left to himself. You could take your kid to the park every day and not give your child the rod and reproof. Some parents, they will only talk about what their child wants to talk about. Just share your heart with me, right? And it's a child-driven relationship where there's no rod, there's no reproof. The child is not in authority, if you will. A child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. Certainly the implication of that phrase is that the kid didn't turn out, right? And why would the mother be ashamed about that? Well, she loves her child, yes, but also it's now public knowledge that she did not give him the rod and reproof, right? So there's that public shame element as well. I've heard it said about children that are in orphanages, especially in other countries where the orphanages are like understaffed and not run very well, that children have a lot of problems when they're not held, they're not touched, there's not time spent with them. Failure to thrive, yes. And I don't know all the facts about, this and that and, this many years and this long and all of those things. But I know if you just leave a child by himself and you just don't talk with him, you don't touch him, you don't do anything with him, that they turn out very badly. Certainly when it says child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame, I think the definition of left to himself is no rod, no reproof. However, the reproof part, if the only time you ever reprove your child is after you spank them, there are some times where children really listen after they're spanking. There's some times where they're just, right? There's not a lot of absorption of facts at that time. So there needs to be time spent with them when it's not in a discipline, situation. Some parents, the only way to get the attention, or the only way the kids get their attention is to get in trouble. That's the only way they spend time with their parents, is get in trouble, right? Well, that doesn't work very well. I read an article this week that said a child needs 9 touches a day to be, and I don't think it's referring to the rod either. But 9 spankings a day. But my broader point in all of this is about the time spent with the child, not leaving them to themselves. Time with children is so vital. Parental laziness will throw them in front of the TV or force them into their rooms for hours on end, and that turns out well for today. It's a great day when the kids sit in front of the TV all day. That's a great day. You know why? Because mom and dad can do whatever they want. They can just leave them be. That's a great day, right? for that day. And the next day might be fine. But you add that up over the years, and you get a child left to himself. And so, there are occasions where we put the kids in front of the screen with something on, but you have to think about the big picture, like how long, how many hours, how many days out of the week is this happening, Because I think there's a lot of parental laziness where we just, especially with technology available, you can just, mesmerize them while they're left to themselves. So I think we understand the truth. Parenting is just plain work sometimes. The blessings, it's kind of like the sowing and reaping, we're talking about. You put in all this work and, this week it doesn't look so good. There's not a lot of reaping going on. They don't always give you that hug and kiss and say, oh, you're so awesome, But you're hoping for a day where they will when they're an adult themselves. So that's all of that. Yes?
I understand the verse, I understand the mother being put to shame and so forth. But is there a reason why it says the mother put to shame as opposed to the father?
Well, that was talked about in some of my study and some of the books and things, and I don't know particularly. Some people say that the mother feels shame more deeply than the father, or that would affect her more.
Women react emotionally
Yeah.
more than men.
Yeah, but when it comes to taking pride in their kids, dads tend to take more pride in their children than their moms do. So, I think there can be a thought there, but I think there's other verses that speak of the mother or of the father being grieved by his wayward child as well. So I wouldn't put a great deal of emphasis on that, but I think it is true that the woman feels that pain perhaps more deeply. And again, some moms don't care about their kids, but we're speaking of in a normal, average context. So I think there might be something there. Yes?
Based in Solomon's context, he had 700 wives, 3 concubines. He probably did not know his children.
Oh, yeah.
But the mothers were the ones that were...
They knew their boys, their kids. Yeah.
It's an idea.
See, we needed a word of wisdom about the wise man Solomon. So there it came. Great point. Okay. And of course, the ones that turned out amazing, Solomon would take credit for it, right? It's the way men are. The wives do all the work and they get the credit for it, So a little bit of a joke, but a little bit of truth mixed in there. Okay. All right. Let's close in prayer. We'll be dismissed. Tyshawn, would you pray as we close?